Hi guys. Tonight we step through a heavy wooden door banded with iron, the hinges groaning low and slow. And the moment it closes behind you, the cold makes itself known. Not a sharp, sudden cold. This one is patient. It presses in quietly, seeping through your clothes, settling against your skin as if it has been waiting for you all along. The stone beneath your feet feels solid, ancient, and immediately hostile. Even before winter truly arrives, the castle already feels like it belongs to the cold more than it belongs to you. You pause. Listening, there is a faint echo to every movement. Your breath sounds louder than it should, somewhere far above. Wind brushes against towers and slips through narrow openings, carrying a soft, restless whistle. This place is impressive. Yes, but welcoming, not even slightly. You probably won't survive this without a very good cloak and an even better tolerance for discomfort. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening late at night, let me know where you are and what time it is for you right now. There's something comforting about knowing we're all awake together, scattered across different places, sharing the same quiet story. Now, dim the lights, and let yourself settle as we move deeper inside. The castle around you is meant to overwhelm. Thick walls rise on every side, built from massive blocks of stone that once took entire teams of laborers to haul into place. This is power made physical. A mainstream historical fact you'd hear in any textbook is that medieval castles were first and foremost military structures, designed to intimidate, defend, and endure sieges that could last months. Comfort simply didn't make the list. Standing here, you can feel that decision radiating from the walls themselves. You trail your fingers along the stone. It's rough, uneven, and cold enough to steal warmth instantly. Stone has a way of remembering winter, holding onto it long after the air outside has softened. Even in summer, castles often stayed chilly, which medieval writers sometimes praised as a luxury during heat waves. But in colder months, that same quality turned every room into a slow test of endurance. The chill doesn't rush you. It waits, confident that time is on its side. There's a strange irony here. You might expect a castle, symbol of wealth and authority, to feel warmer than a poor peasant's hut. After all, castles required vast resources to build and maintain. Lords commanded forests for timber, quarries for stone, and entire villages for labor. Yet, as you stand in this drafty hall, you begin to sense that money and warmth were not always close companions in the medieval world. A quirky detail that often surprises people is that some castles were deliberately left partially unfinished on the inside. Bare stone walls weren't just a sign of austerity, they were practical. Plaster and wood paneling could burn during an attack, and fire was one of the most feared siege weapons. Leaving stone exposed reduced risk, even if it meant living in rooms that felt like the inside of a cave. Safety first. Cozy never. You take a few steps forward, and the sound of your movement travels farther than expected. High ceilings loom overhead, designed to make attackers feel small and to disperse smoke from fires. But those ceilings also allow warm air to drift uselessly upward. Far out of reach, you're already beginning to understand that everything here serves a purpose. And that purpose is rarely your comfort. Historians still argue whether medieval elites truly understood just how inefficient these buildings were at retaining heat, or whether they simply accepted the cold as an unavoidable companion of power. Written records show plenty of complaints about winter misery, but very few serious attempts to redesign castles for warmth. It seems that once stone walls went up, adaptation happened at the human level instead. As you move deeper inside, you notice how the light behaves. Small windows, if you can call them that, allow thin blades of daylight to cut across the interior. These openings are narrow, angled, and set deep into the walls. They are perfect for archers and terrible for sunlight. The room feels perpetually dim, which somehow makes the cold feel heavier, more intimate. Darkness and chill often arrive together. You imagine living here day after day, waking up with stiff fingers, dressing quickly, not for modesty, but to trap what little warmth you can generate. Even nobles slept wearing layers, sometimes hats and gloves, because once the fire died down overnight, the cold returned without mercy. This isn't the romantic medieval life of glowing hearths and endless feasts. This is endurance dressed up as grandeur. There's an old fringe anecdote that some castle residents believed cold stone improved moral discipline. Warmth, in this view, encouraged laziness and indulgence. A chilly environment kept the mind sharp and the body alert. Or so the thinking went. Whether anyone truly enjoyed this supposed benefit is another question entirely. But the idea itself says a lot about medieval attitudes toward comfort and virtue. You pause again, listening to the subtle soundtrack of the place. A distant drip of water echoes from somewhere unseen. Moisture is everywhere in castles, creeping in through stone and settling into mortar. Damp air feels colder than dry air, and it clings to you in a way that's hard to shake, even with a fire burning somewhere nearby. The overall sensation is one of persistent chill. What's striking is how quickly your expectations adjust. After only a short time inside, you stop expecting warmth at all. Instead, you begin to think in terms of coping. Where can you stand that's least drafty? How close can you get to the fire without breathing too much smoke? Which doorway leaks the most wind? Medieval castle life trains you to notice these details the way modern life trains you to notice Wi-Fi signals and power outlets. You're still near the entrance, still at the beginning of this journey, but already the lesson is clear. Castles were never meant to feel like homes in the modern sense. They were statements. They were shields. They were tools of control carved in stone. And stone, as you're learning, has no sympathy for the human body. As you continue forward, the cold follows. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to. It knows that the deeper you go, the more you'll understand why people who lived in far humbler buildings sometimes slept warmer than the lords who ruled from these walls. The story of medieval cold is only just beginning, and it stretches far beyond this first shiver. You keep moving, deeper into the castle, and with every step the intention behind the building becomes clearer. This place was never meant to nurture you. It was meant to protect land, intimidate rivals, and survive violence. Everything else came second. As you walk beneath a stone archway, you can almost feel the priorities of its builders pressing down from above. Castles were born from fear. Fear of invasion, rebellion, and sudden attack. A mainstream historical fact that shapes everything you see here is that most medieval castles were constructed during periods of frequent warfare, when borders shifted often and power depended on the ability to hold ground. Thick walls could stop arrows, resist battering rams, and slow fire. Comfort, meanwhile, could not stop an army. You notice how the walls seem excessively thick, far more than what would be needed just to hold up a roof. In some castles, these walls reach several meters in width. That thickness absorbs cold like a sponge. Once winter settles into the stone, it stays there, long after the outside air begins to warm. The castle doesn't respond to seasons quickly. It lags behind, trapped in yesterday's weather. As you pass through another chamber, you realize how little wood is used inside. Wood burns. Stone does not. That simple reality shaped medieval architecture in ways that still surprise people today. Floors are stone. Walls are stone. Even staircases spiral upward in stone coils that echo with every footstep. Fire, always a threat during a siege, was controlled carefully, limited to specific hearths and kitchens. Heat was localized, cautious, and never allowed to spread freely. There's a strange tension here. The very features that made castles strong made them miserable to live in. Narrow corridors slowed attackers, but they also funneled wind. High walls blocked ladders, but they also blocked sunlight. Defensive towers offered commanding views. yet turned into frozen spires during winter months. You can feel that conflict everywhere you go. A lesser-known detail that often surprises modern listeners is that some castles were intentionally positioned on exposed hilltops rather than sheltered valleys. Height provided visibility and strategic advantage. It also meant relentless wind. Cold air sweeps across elevated ground with enthusiasm. And once it finds a gap in the stonework, it rushes inside, even on calm days. Castles breathe cold air like living creatures. You imagine standing watch on a tower in January, fingers stiff, face numb, the wind never fully stopping. Guards rotated frequently, not out of kindness, but necessity. Frostbite was a real danger, even if medieval people didn't use the word the way we do now. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was a constant occupational hazard. Historians still debate whether castle builders fully grasped the thermal consequences of their designs, or whether they simply lacked better alternatives. Some argue that knowledge of insulation was limited. Others point out that people did understand warmth very well, just not at the scale castles required. It's one thing to heat a single-room cottage. It's another to warm a stone complex the size of a small village. As you move past an arrow slit, you pause and peer outside. The opening is narrow on the exterior, wider on the inside, designed to give archers room to maneuver. It's a clever piece of engineering. It's also a perfect channel for cold air. Wind squeezes through the slit and spreads into the room, thin but persistent, like fingers probing for exposed skin. There's an old anecdote that some lords preferred the cold because it kept servants alert and discouraged loitering. Whether that's true or just a bit of medieval sarcasm passed down through time, it reflects an attitude that discomfort was acceptable, even useful. Power did not require warmth. Obedience did. You walk into a great hall now, the symbolic heart of the castle. This is where feasts were held, where justice was dispensed, where alliances were forged under flickering torchlight. And yet, even here, the cold dominates. The room is vast, the ceiling impossibly high. One or two large hearths burn along the walls, their flames impressive but inadequate. The heat they produce rises straight upward, disappearing into darkness long before it reaches the edges of the room. Sound behaves differently here. Your footsteps echo. Voices would too, bouncing off stone surfaces and lingering longer than expected. This acoustic quality added to the sense of authority, making every word spoken by a lord feel weightier. But stone that carries sound also carries cold, reflecting it back into the room again and again. A quirky fringe detail from medieval household accounts mentions that during especially cold winters, some noble families retreated from their castles altogether, choosing to stay in smaller manor houses until spring. Castles were symbols and strongholds, not always permanent residences. When survival outweighed status, practicality sometimes won. You begin to see the castle less as a home and more as a machine. Every part serves a function tied to control and defense. Even the layout encourages separation. Private chambers are tucked away, accessible through narrow staircases that limit movement. Servants sleep wherever space allows, often in corridors or storage rooms, where cold settles without resistance. As you stand near the center of the hall, you realize that medieval comfort was not about temperature the way it is for us. It was about security. Being safe behind stone walls mattered more than being warm. A peasant might shiver less at night, but they slept with the knowledge that a single raid could destroy everything they owned. Here, in the cold heart of the castle, at least the walls would hold. That trade-off defines so much of medieval life. Warmth versus protection. Comfort versus control. The castle chooses sides without hesitation. And as you continue walking, the cold feels less like an accident and more like a consequence. The unavoidable price paid for living inside a fortress rather than a home. The further you go, the more you understand that this cold isn't just physical. It's emotional. It's architectural. It's baked into the very idea of what a castle was meant to be. And it follows you onward, patient and unyielding. As the story continues to unfold, You start to notice it most when you stop moving. The moment your body goes still, the cold reaches up and settles into you, as if it had been waiting politely for silence. The stone around you doesn't just feel cold, it feels ancient, saturated with winters stacked one on top of another, each season pressed into the walls like layers of memory. You look up, and the height of the space becomes impossible to ignore. The ceiling stretches far above your head, disappearing into shadow. It's impressive, almost theatrical, but your body understands the problem immediately. Heat doesn't linger where you are. It rises, drifting upward, pooling uselessly near rafters and beams no one can touch. Down here, where you stand, the air stays stubbornly cool. People in the Middle Ages didn't need modern physics to sense this. Anyone who had ever sat near a fire knew that warmth climbs. Castles, with their towering halls and vertical ambition, worked against their own occupants. The higher the ceiling, the further warmth had to travel before it could do any good. You can almost picture it now. Heat lifting off the flames, thinning as it goes, fading into the dark overhead like a promise never kept. The stone itself makes things worse. Thick masonry walls are excellent at resisting force. They blunt arrows, absorb blows, and shrug off fire. But stone is slow to warm and quick to steal heat from anything that touches it. When winter arrives, it sinks deep into those walls and stays there. Long after spring, sunlight returns outside. You're not just feeling today's cold, you're feeling last month's. There's an easily missed detail that helps explain why this mattered so much. Many castles were lived in continuously for generations. Once cold became embedded in the structure, it never truly left. Fires went out at night, rooms cooled. By morning, stone had reclaimed its territory. Warming a castle wasn't a daily task. It was a losing campaign. You lean against a wall for a moment, and instantly regret it. The chill seeps straight through your clothing. Medieval people learned quickly not to rest directly on stone. Benches were wooden when possible. Walls were later draped with fabric. Even so, contact was unavoidable. Narrow corridors forced you close. Spiral staircases pressed you against curved stone as you climbed. Cold was part of movement itself. Some architectural historians point out that castle height was as much about psychology as defense. Tall ceilings inspired awe. They made visitors feel small, controlled, and aware of power above them. That sense of scale mattered deeply in a hierarchical society. If discomfort reinforced authority, it was tolerated. Warmth, in this context, was secondary to symbolism. You imagine winter feasts held in halls like this. Long tables, flickering candles, food steaming briefly before cooling too fast. People huddled closer than etiquette normally allowed. Not for affection, but for shared heat. Even the wealthiest guests would have kept cloaks on. Fingers curled around cups not just for ceremony, but survival. A curious note, tucked into a household account from Northern Europe, mentions servants tasked with carrying hot stones from the hearth to seating areas. These stones were wrapped in cloth and placed under benches or near feet. It was a temporary solution, and a risky one, but it hints at how desperate people were to fight the cold at ground level, where bodies actually existed. You notice how your breath behaves differently in this space. It lingers longer than expected. Faint clouds hanging in the air before dissolving. Sound does the same thing. Every movement echoes, bouncing off stone, returning softened and delayed. The building feels hollow, not empty, but vast in a way that works against intimacy and warmth alike. There's still disagreement among experts about whether medieval builders underestimated these effects or simply accepted them. Some designs suggest awareness. Tapestries appear later. Wooden paneling becomes more common in certain regions, but the core structure never changes. Stone remains dominant. Height remains celebrated. Whatever lessons were learned, they were layered on top of an unyielding foundation. You take a slow walk across the hall, counting your steps without meaning to. Each footfall sends a faint vibration through the floor, Stone floors absorb cold from the earth beneath them, turning every surface into a subtle conductor. In winter, the ground itself becomes part of the castle's cooling system, drawing heat away without effort. This is where the comparison with peasant homes begins to quietly form, even if you don't realize it yet. Smaller spaces, lower ceilings, packed earth floors warmed by bodies, animals, and constant fires. Those homes weren't designed for prestige, but they accidentally solve problems castles created for themselves. Here, grandeur multiplies the cold. Scale works against comfort. The building is too large, too proud, too vertical to respond quickly to human needs. You're a small source of heat in an enormous container, and the container always wins. You pause beneath one of the highest points of the ceiling and look up again, somewhere above you. Warmth is collecting, completely out of reach. It's almost cruel in its efficiency. The fire does its job. Physics does its job. The castle does its job. And you, standing here, are left to adapt. That adaptation becomes a way of life. Movement replaces rest. Layers replace insulation. Ritual replaces comfort. Over time, people living here stop expecting warmth in the modern sense. Instead, they learn to manage cold the way sailors manage waves. You don't defeat it. You endure it. As you move on, the height of the space slowly recedes behind you, but the lesson stays close. In castles, size and strength came at a cost. Stone and height, meant to project power, quietly siphoned away warmth, leaving those inside to negotiate with winter every single day. You notice the drafts before you fully understand them, not as a single gust, but as a constant, low-level movement against your skin, a brush along your neck, a cool ribbon sliding around your ankles. The air inside the castle is never still. Even when everything looks solid and unmoving, the building breathes. You stop near a doorway and feel it immediately. Cold air sneaks in from somewhere unseen, curling around the stone like water finding a crack. Medieval castles were full of these invisible pathways, gaps between stones, slight warping in wooden doors, openings designed for arrows, signals, and observation. Each one serves its purpose. Each one also invites the cold. The idea of sealing a building airtight would have felt strange, even dangerous. To medieval builders, fresh air mattered. Smoke needed somewhere to go. Fires burned constantly. And without modern chimneys or flues, ventilation happened wherever it could. Castles, in particular, relied on a patchwork of openings to manage smoke from hearths and torches. The result was a permanent exchange between inside and outside, whether you wanted it or not. You walk past a narrow slit in the wall and feel a thin stream of air slide across your cheek. These openings were angled carefully, wider on the inside than the outside, allowing defenders to aim while limiting incoming fire. That same design accelerates wind. Air squeezes through, picking up speed, then fans out into the room. It's subtle, but relentless. People living here would have known exactly which rooms were worst. Certain chambers earned reputations for being especially drafty, avoided when possible, tolerated when necessary. Sleeping near an exterior wall was something you did only if you had no choice. Even then, you positioned the bed carefully, angled away from the worst gaps, layered with whatever fabrics you could find. There's a small but telling detail buried in medieval repair records. Castle accounts often mention payments to masons for repointing walls, pressing fresh mortar into cracks where stone had shifted. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about stopping water, wind, and cold from sneaking in. Even with constant maintenance, the stone never fully sealed. Time and weather always found a way back inside. You move into a stairwell now, one of those narrow, spiraling passages tucked inside the wall itself. The air changes immediately. Cooler, sharper. These staircases act like chimneys in reverse, pulling cold air downward from higher levels. Wind catches inside them, spiraling just as you do, brushing against your legs as you descend. There's a reason medieval people often described castles as bleak, even when they admired them. Bleak didn't just mean emotionally severe, it meant exposed, wind-bitten, unforgiving. These structures stood proudly against the landscape, but they also absorbed every change in weather without apology. Some surviving letters hint that castle residents tried improvising solutions. Heavy curtains were hung not just for privacy, but to block drafts from doorways. Tapestries doubled as windbreaks. Wooden screens were placed strategically to redirect airflow. None of this eliminated the problem. It just softened it enough to make life bearable. You stand still again, listening. Somewhere, high above, the wind howls around a tower. You don't hear it directly. You hear its effects. A low whistle through stone, a faint hum that never fully fades. Even at night, when everything else quiets down, the castle keeps moving air through itself. There's an odd habit recorded in some regions where people stuffed straw, moss, or even cloth into wall gaps during winter. It was a temporary fix, removed in warmer months to restore airflow. This constant seasonal adjustment shows how dynamic life inside a castle really was. The building never adapted on its own. People had to negotiate with it daily. Experts still don't fully agree on how aware medieval builders were of airflow dynamics. Some designs suggest deliberate channeling of wind, especially in defensive contexts. Others seem accidental, the result of stacking practical decisions without considering their combined effect. Either way, the lived experience was the same. You could feel the air moving. Always, you pass through another doorway, this one heavy and thick, reinforced with iron bands. When it closes behind you, the sound is deep and final. For a moment, the air feels calmer. Then the drafts find new paths. Under the door, around the hinges, through the stone itself, the castle adjusts, redistributing cold like a system correcting pressure. In winter, this movement becomes exhausting. Fires fight drafts constantly. Heat pours upward, while cold slides in sideways. You warm one corner of a room only to feel chill reclaim it moments later. It's not dramatic. It's persistent. That's what makes it so draining. You imagine trying to sleep here. You drift off for a while, wrapped in layers, only to wake when a draft finds an opening in your blankets. The cold isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It simply reminds you that rest is temporary. That warmth must be defended even in sleep. People often picture medieval nights as dark and silent. Inside a castle, they were full of subtle motion, curtains shifting, flames flickering sideways, smoke drifting unpredictably. The building never fully settled, and neither did the people inside it. As you move on, you begin to understand that the cold in castles isn't just about temperature, it's about movement. Still, air can be warmed. Moving air steals heat efficiently and without mercy. The castle's very design ensures that air is always on the move. This is another place where the contrast with smaller homes quietly sharpens. In tight spaces, drafts are easier to block. Fires dominate the room. Air circulates less. Here, in stone corridors and tall chambers, the cold has room to roam. You take one last slow breath before leaving the stairwell. The air feels thin, restless, never content to stay where it is. Drafts like these never sleep. They patrol the castle day and night, slipping through every opening, reminding you that walls can keep out enemies. But they struggle to keep out winter. And as you continue deeper inside, you carry that sensation with you. Not just the cold itself, but the sense that the building is always in motion, quietly conspiring with the weather beyond its walls. You find the fire before you feel its warmth. A faint orange flicker dances against the stone, reflected weakly across a wide hearth carved into the wall. The fireplace is enormous, large enough to stand inside if you had to. It looks powerful, reassuring, even. And yet, as you step closer, you realize how little it actually changes the room. The fire crackles steadily. Logs stacked thick and heavy. Flames licking upward with confidence. This is no modest household hearth. This is the kind built to impress guests and feed dozens at once. And still, only a narrow halo of warmth surrounds it. 2 steps back, and the chill returns. Polite but firm, as if reminding you not to expect miracles. Medieval fireplaces were feats of engineering for their time, but they were also brutally inefficient. Most were open hearths, designed to vent smoke upward into large chimneys that rose straight through the structure. The problem is simple. Heat follows smoke. As hot air rushes up and out, very little of it stays behind. What warmth you feel is radiant, not ambient. Once you step out of its direct line, the room swallows you again. You hold your hands out, palms toward the fire, and feel your fingers slowly loosen. Turn your back, and the cold presses in immediately, like a hand between your shoulder blades. This push and pull becomes second nature. People learn to rotate, warm the front, then the back, then the front again. Comfort arrives in fragments, never all at once. There's a detail hidden in old architectural drawings that explains why fireplaces struggled so much. In large halls, hearths were often placed along exterior walls to make chimney construction easier. That means the fire is working directly against cold stone that leads outside. Even as it burns, much of its energy is pulled straight into the wall itself, warming stone instead of people. You notice the smoke now. It doesn't always behave. Sometimes it rises cleanly. Other times it spills into the room, hanging low, stinging eyes and throats. Chimneys weren't always reliable, especially in changing weather. A shift in wind could reverse the flow, pushing smoke back down into living spaces. On those days, you chose between coughing in warmth or breathing clean air in the cold. Some records describe servants assigned to keep fires going constantly during winter, feeding them through the night. Letting a fire die meant starting over in the morning, when the room had already surrendered completely to cold. Even so, maintaining heat was a losing battle. Fires consumed vast amounts of wood, and castles burned through fuel at astonishing rates. An overlooked habit from this period is how people positioned themselves socially around the fire. Rank determined proximity. The lord sat closest. Important guests followed. Everyone else arranged themselves outward in widening rings of cold. Warmth became a visible symbol of status, measured in steps rather than words. You imagine long evenings spent like this. The fire roaring, shadows climbing the walls, conversation drifting in and out as people edge closer, then retreat when smoke thickens. It's not the cozy gathering modern imagery suggests. It's strategic, calculated, a constant negotiation between heat and air. There's still debate about whether medieval builders could have improved fireplace efficiency significantly with the knowledge they had. Some later designs, especially toward the end of the Middle Ages, show attempts to narrow chimneys or add hoods to better capture heat. Results were mixed. Small improvements helped private chambers, but great halls remained stubbornly cold. You walk along the length of the hall and notice additional hearths, smaller and darker, long unused. Fires were expensive. Fuel had to be cut, hauled, and stored. Lighting every fireplace at once wasn't realistic, even for wealthy households. Most rooms stayed cold most of the time, warmed only when occupied or when status demanded it. A curious note from one estate inventory lists warming pans among household goods. These were metal containers filled with hot coals and slid between bedding before sleep. They didn't heat rooms. They heated bodies. It's a small distinction, but an important one. Medieval warmth was personal, localized, and temporary. You stand again near the fire and listen. The crackle is comforting, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. It draws people in. Fire has always done that. But in this space, its authority is limited. Stone walls loom unmoved. Drafts continue to creep. Heat rises, escapes, and disappears. Even the scale of the fireplace works against it. Large openings allow more air to rush through, feeding flames but also pulling warmth upward faster. A smaller hearth in a low-ceilinged room can feel far warmer than this massive construction ever could. This is another quiet irony of castle life. Grandeur magnifies inefficiency. The things meant to impress guests also magnify discomfort. Fireplaces become symbols rather than solutions. Proof that warmth is present somewhere, even if it can't quite reach you. You imagine winter mornings here. Ashes cold. Stone colder. Fire starting from nothing. Hands numb as flint strikes steel. Until flames catch and grow. The room offers no mercy. Even then, it takes time. A lot of time. As you move away from the hearth, the warmth fades almost immediately. The cold returns. Familiar now. Like a companion you've stopped arguing with. You begin to understand that in castles, fire wasn't about transforming space. It was about survival in pockets. Islands of heat in a sea of stone. And as you walk on, leaving the glow behind, the lesson stays with you. Fire could fight cold. But it could never conquer it here. Not in rooms this large. Not against walls this thick. The flames did what they could. And the rest was left to human endurance. As you leave the fire behind, the smell lingers longer than the warmth ever did. A mix of smoke, charred wood, and something faintly sour clings to the air. It settles into your clothes, your hair, your breath. In a castle, smoke never truly leaves. It drifts, thins, circles back, and waits. You notice it most when you tilt your head upward. Above you, the space darkens where smoke has stained the stone over decades, even centuries. Blackened patches creep along arches and ceiling beams, quiet records of countless fires that tried, and failed, to warm these rooms. The soot tells a story the temperature already hinted at. Ventilation was always a compromise. Fires needed oxygen. Smoke needed escape. People needed air that wouldn't choke them in their sleep. Without modern flues or sealed chimneys, castles relied on a mixture of vertical shafts, open hearths, and whatever gaps happened to exist in the stonework. The result was an interior atmosphere that was constantly in motion, never fully warm, never fully clear. You feel a faint sting in your eyes now. Even though the fire is behind you, smoke has a way of travelling, slipping through doorways and along ceilings, then slowly sinking as it cools. At night, when fires burned lower and airflow changed, smoke often settled into sleeping areas. People learned to live with irritated throats and smarting eyes because the alternative was freezing. There's an old observation tucked into monastic writings, noting that clean air belongs to summer. In winter, air came at a price. You could have warmth and smoke, or clarity and cold. Most people chose warmth, especially when the choice had to last through long nights. You step into a chamber where the ceiling lowers slightly, and the smell intensifies. Here, the smoke has fewer places to go. It pools gently, just below head height, as if hovering on purpose. This is where ventilation quietly steals heat. Every pathway that lets smoke escape also allows warm air to follow it out. People at the time understood this in a practical way. You see it in how rooms were used. Fires burned brightest during meals and gatherings, when people were awake and active. At night, flames were reduced to embers. Smoke lessened, but so did heat. By morning, the cold had reclaimed the space completely. An easily overlooked detail from household records mentions bundles of herbs hung near hearths. These weren't just for fragrance. Rosemary, juniper, and other plants were believed to cleanse the air, masking smoke and making breathing easier. Whether they truly helped or simply provided comfort is unclear. But the practice was widespread enough to matter. You breathe slowly, adjusting. Smoke becomes part of the background, like the hum of distant wind. Medieval lungs were accustomed to it in ways modern ones are not. Still, it shaped daily life. Long exposure meant coughing, irritation, and in some cases, chronic breathing issues. Warmth came with a cost that followed you everywhere. There's still no single answer to how medieval builders thought about airflow. Some designs suggest careful planning, with smoke channels angled to pull fumes upward efficiently. Others seem almost accidental, relying on sheer volume to dilute smoke rather than remove it. What's clear is that heat loss was accepted as part of the process. You notice how people position themselves again. Heads tilt downward when possible. Beds are placed lower, away from smoky ceilings. Sitting on the floor, uncomfortable as it is, sometimes meant clearer air. Comfort wasn't just about warmth. It was about choosing which discomfort you could tolerate longer. In larger halls, the problem multiplies. Smoke rises, spreads, and cools before escaping. As it cools, it sinks again, drifting back down like a slow tide. This constant circulation prevents heat from settling anywhere for long. Warm air never gets the chance to stay where bodies are. There's a quiet irony here. The very systems meant to make castle life survivable undermine each other. Fire brings warmth but creates smoke. Smoke demands ventilation. Ventilation invites cold. The cycle repeats endlessly. With no perfect solution, you pass a window opening and feel cooler air brush your face. Fresher but sharper. The smoke thins here, but the temperature drops. People would have noticed this trade immediately. Openings cleared the air but punished the skin. Closing them trapped smoke but preserved what little warmth the fire produced. Some castle residents adjusted by spending winters in smaller interior rooms with lower ceilings. These chambers trapped smoke and heat more effectively, even if the air grew stale. Sleeping quarters often sacrificed cleanliness for warmth, especially during the coldest months. You imagine lying in bed, eyes half closed, smoke drifting above you like low clouds, breathing shallowly, turning your head to find clearer air, pulling blankets tighter as the cold creeps in from below. Rest was never complete. It was negotiated. Night after night. There's a mention in a noblewoman's letter of waking with soot on her pillow. The fire below had burned all night, and smoke had slowly descended as the embers cooled. She writes about brushing it away without much comment, as if it were no more remarkable than dust. This acceptance tells you a lot. Castle life demanded tolerance. Smoke, cold, dampness, and drafts blended into a single environment. People learned not to fight too hard. Complaints existed, but resignation was more common. As you continue walking, the smell finally fades a little, replaced by cooler, cleaner air. Your lungs relax, but your shoulders tense as the cold strengthens. One discomfort traded for another. That balance follows you everywhere inside these walls. By now, it's clear that castles were never sealed worlds. Air moved freely, carrying heat away as easily as it carried smoke out. Every breath you take reminds you that warmth here was temporary, borrowed, and always slipping away. And as you move onward, the lesson deepens. The cold wasn't just a result of stone and size. It was the outcome of constant compromise, where every attempt to make life livable quietly gave winter another way inside. You feel it most when you look down. The cold doesn't just surround you here. It rises. It seeps upward from beneath your feet, slow and persistent, as if the ground itself is breathing winter into the room. Stone floors stretch out in every direction, smooth in places, uneven in others, but always unforgiving. You take a step and imagine doing this barefoot. Many people did. Slippers, when they existed, were thin. Boots were often removed indoors to keep dirt from spreading. The moment skin met stone, heat drained away instantly, even through layers of wool and leather. The cold pressed upward, climbing through your legs and settling into your bones. Stone floors were a practical choice. They didn't burn. They were durable. They could handle heavy traffic, spilled food, dropped tools, and the constant movement of people and animals. Over time, they became the default surface for castles. especially in main rooms and corridors. Comfort never factored heavily into that decision. The earth beneath those stones mattered too. Many castle floors were laid directly over packed soil or shallow foundations. In winter, the ground itself cooled, turning the floor into a vast heat sink. Whatever warmth the fire managed to produce was slowly pulled downward, absorbed by layers of earth that never noticed the effort. People adapted in small ways. Rushes were scattered across floors, mixed with straw, herbs, and whatever else was available. These layers added a bit of insulation and helped soak up moisture. Over time, they compressed into a spongy mat underfoot. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but it was warmer than bare stone. In wealthier areas, wooden platforms were sometimes built over sections of floor, especially near beds or seating. These raised surfaces trapped a thin layer of air underneath, offering slight relief from the cold below. Even so, the difference was modest. Winter always found a way through. There's a detail from a northern castle inventory listing multiple footstools near benches and chairs. These weren't decorative. They lifted feet just enough to reduce contact with the cold floor. Sitting with feet flat on stone for hours could numb toes quickly. Elevation mattered. You notice how people would have shifted their weight constantly. One foot raised, then the other, legs tucked beneath bodies when sitting. Movement wasn't just habit, it was temperature management. Stillness meant surrendering warmth to the floor. Some accounts mention people sleeping with their feet wrapped separately, even inside blankets. Feet were vulnerable. Once they went numb, rest became impossible. The cold rose slowly, targeting extremities first, then creeping inward. There's disagreement among researchers about how widespread floor coverings truly were in castles. Some evidence suggests rushes were changed infrequently, becoming compacted and unsanitary. Others argue that elite spaces were better maintained. What's clear is that even at their best, these coverings offered limited insulation. You walk across a chamber now and notice the sound of your steps change. Bare stone echoes sharply. Areas with rushes muffle sound slightly. The quieter surface also feels marginally warmer. It's a subtle difference. But in winter, subtlety mattered. You imagine the daily rhythm. Rushes scattered in autumn, trod down through winter, swept out in spring. The floor itself becomes part of the seasonal cycle, reflecting the slow negotiation between humans and cold stone. There's a strange contrast here. Walls, ceilings, and windows attract attention because they frame the space. Floors are often ignored, yet they play a huge role in how cold feels. Heat rises. Yes, but cold claims ground first. Every moment spent standing or sitting connects you directly to it. Children, shorter and closer to the floor, felt this even more. Small bodies lost heat faster. In a castle, warmth was literally above their heads, unreachable. It's not surprising that children were often kept near fires or bundled heavily. Even indoors, you stop walking and stand still again. The cold creeps upward, steady and patient. It doesn't shock you anymore. It reminds you, every surface here participates in the environment. Nothing is neutral. In smaller homes, floors were often packed earth. When animals shared living spaces, their body heat warmed the ground slightly. Fires burned closer to the floor, radiating warmth downward as well as up. Here, fire sits high in the hearth, heat pulled away before it can sink. That difference is important. In castles, cold comes from below and above. In simpler homes, warmth pools where people live. The architecture itself decides who gets to be comfortable. You imagine sitting through a long meeting in this room. Stone beneath you, drafts brushing your neck, smoke drifting overhead, the floor quietly draining warmth the entire time. Fatigue sets in faster in the cold. Muscles stiffen. Concentration slips. The environment shapes behavior whether you notice or not. There's an odd mention in one record of servants laying animal skins directly on stone during extreme cold, creating temporary warm zones. These skins weren't for decoration, they were survival tools, moved from place to place as needed. As you walk on, the floor remains constant beneath you, an unbroken reminder that castles were never insulated from the ground they stood on. Power rose upward in towers and walls, but cold climbed just as faithfully from below. You begin to understand how exhausting this environment could be over months. Not dramatic suffering, just constant, low-level cold pressing in from every angle. It wears you down quietly. And as you move toward the next chamber, lifting your feet slightly faster than before, you carry that awareness with you. In castles, even the ground worked against you, reminding you that stone protects. But it also takes. You notice the windows next. Or rather, you notice what they are not. They are not wide. They are not welcoming. They are not designed to let light or warmth flood in. Instead, they appear as narrow cuts in the stone, carefully measured, sharply angled, and deeply set, like wounds that never quite healed. You step closer to one and peer out. The opening is barely wide enough for your shoulders on the inside, tapering to a slit on the outside. This shape makes sense once you remember its purpose. These openings were shaped for survival, not scenery. They allowed defenders to watch, aim, and fire while exposing as little of themselves as possible. Every inch of stone mattered when arrows were flying. But as you stand there, the cost becomes obvious. Sunlight enters reluctantly, filtered and thin. Whatever warmth it carries is gone almost as soon as it arrives. In winter, the sun sits low in the sky, its rays already weak. By the time they pass through thick stone walls, they feel more symbolic than useful. Glass, when it existed at all, was rare and imperfect. Most windows remained uncovered, sealed only with wooden shutters or cloth when the weather turned harsh. Even in castles wealthy enough to afford glass, the panes were small, uneven, and riddled with gaps. They rattled in the wind, announcing every gust like a warning. You feel it now. A steady trickle of cold air slips through the opening, brushing your face. It's sharper here, more focused, as if the wind has been compressed by stone before being released into the room. Windows become delivery systems for winter, funneling the outside directly inside. People learned to work around them. Shutters were closed early. Curtains were hung thick and heavy. In some castles, windows were blocked entirely during the coldest months. Sacrificed for the sake of warmth, darkness was preferable to freezing. There's a telling phrase that appears in several medieval household instructions, warning against sitting long at the light. It wasn't about eyesight. It was about cold. Windows were dangerous places in winter, even during the day. Lingering too close invited numbness and stiffness. You imagine sitting beside one to read or sew. Fingers would lose feeling quickly. Breath would fog the air. The light might help your eyes, but your body would protest almost immediately. In a castle, comfort always involved trade-offs. Some later castles experimented with glazing entire windows, using leaded glass to seal openings more fully. It helped. But not much. Glass of the period was thick, cloudy, and often cracked. Even intact, it did little to stop heat from escaping. Stone frames pulled warmth away just as efficiently as bare openings. There's no full agreement among historians about how people perceived this trade. Some suggest windows were seen as luxuries worth the discomfort, especially in ceremonial spaces. Others believe light mattered less than survival, and many windows were left deliberately small to reduce heat loss. Both ideas likely coexisted, varying by region and wealth. You notice how the windows shape the atmosphere of each room. Light pools in narrow bands, leaving corners dim and cold. Shadows linger longer. The space feels divided, fractured by beams of brightness that never quite warm what they touch. At night, windows turn from weak allies into outright enemies. Cold pours in unchecked. Shutters help, but wood shrinks and warps with time. Gaps appear. Wind slips through. carrying damp air that clings to skin and fabric alike. There's a small, easily overlooked detail in some castle ruins. Stone seats built into window recesses. These were places to sit, to watch, to think. In winter, they became some of the coldest spots in the building. Sitting there for long required determination or distraction. Beauty and discomfort shared the same space. You run your hand along the stone inside the recess. It's colder here than elsewhere, as if the wall itself has been storing winter. This is where inside and outside meet most directly. The boundary is thin, and you can feel it. In contrast, peasant homes often had fewer openings. Smoke escaped through roofs and doors, but windows were minimal. Light came from fire more than sun. It wasn't ideal, but it kept warmth inside more effectively. Again, necessity solved a problem, prestige created. You step away from the window and feel immediate relief. The air grows stiller, warmer, if only slightly. It's a reminder that warmth in a castle exists only in certain zones, carefully navigated like safe paths across ice. Windows, for all their symbolism, were never meant to make life comfortable. They were eyes, weapons, and weak points all at once. Their design reflects priorities that have little to do with human warmth. You imagine winter mornings here, pale light creeping through narrow slits, frost tracing patterns on shutters, breath visible even indoors. The day begins cold and stays that way, regardless of how bright it looks outside. As you move on, leaving the window behind, the light fades and the cold softens just a little. You begin to appreciate how people learned the geography of warmth within these walls. Where to stand, where not to linger, where winter enters most eagerly, and you carry that awareness forward. In castles, even light came at a cost. Every opening that let the world in also let the cold follow close behind, patient and precise. You become aware of the damp before you consciously name it. It clings to the air, heavier than the cold itself, settling on your skin in a way that makes every breath feel slightly weighted. The castle doesn't just sit in winter, it sits in moisture, and that moisture changes everything. You pause near an outer wall and notice how the stone looks darker here, almost glossy in places. Water has seeped in slowly, patiently, over years. Rain, fog, melted snow. Even when the sky clears, the stone remembers. Castles were often surrounded by moats, rivers, marshy ground, or damp lowlands chosen for defense. Water made attacks harder. It also ensured that humidity was a permanent guest inside. Moats were marvels of medieval engineering and strategy. They slowed enemies, prevented tunneling, and made siege engines harder to position. But they also raised the local water table. Moisture crept upward through foundations, into walls, and across floors. The castle drank from its own defences. You feel it in the air now. Cold air alone is unpleasant. Cold, damp air is exhausting. It sinks into fabric, making clothes heavier and slower to dry. It settles into joints and muscles, turning stiffness into ache. Even a modest chill feels sharper when moisture amplifies it. People living here understood this instinctively. They complained less about cold than about wet cold, a phrase that appears again and again in letters and records. Dry frost could be managed. Damp chill lingered, refusing to leave even when fires burned steadily. You step closer to a wall and notice faint salt-like stains where water has evaporated over time. This slow movement of moisture through stone was impossible to stop entirely with medieval technology. Mortar absorbed it. Stone carried it. The building breathed water as much as air. In winter, this moisture became especially punishing. Cold stone condensed water from the air, creating surfaces that were perpetually clammy. Touching a wall felt worse than touching ice. The cold wasn't just temperature, it was texture. There's a small note in a castle steward's account mentioning repeated efforts to keep bedding dry. Blankets and furs absorbed moisture easily, losing their insulating power. Damp bedding felt colder than no bedding at all. Fires could dry them, but only slowly, and space near hearths was limited. You imagine trying to warm yourself wrapped in a heavy wool cloak that never fully dries. It smells faintly of smoke and mildew. It weighs more than it should. Instead of trapping warmth, it steals it, conducting cold straight into your body. Some castles tried elevating floors or adding wooden platforms to reduce contact with damp stone. Others lined walls with fabric or wood to create barriers. These measures helped, but they were never complete solutions. Moisture always found a path. There's still discussion among scholars about whether castles near water were significantly colder than those on drier ground. Some evidence suggests inland hilltop fortresses fared slightly better in winter. Others argue that wind exposure cancelled out any advantage. What seems clear is that moisture, wherever it came from, made cold feel deeper and harder to escape. You hear a faint drip echoing somewhere nearby. Water moving slowly through stone finds its way out eventually. That sound, barely audible, would have been familiar to anyone living here. It's the sound of the castle aging, season after season, absorbing and releasing the world around it. Dampness also affected fires. Wet air makes combustion less efficient. Smoke hangs longer. Heat disperses faster. On especially wet days, fires struggled more than usual, their warmth fading quickly as moisture pulled energy away. You notice how people would have clustered even closer together during such times. Shared warmth mattered more when the environment conspired against every other solution. Proximity became insulation. In contrast, many peasant homes were built with raised floors, packed earth that dried quickly, or wooden structures that breathed differently. Without massive stone walls, moisture didn't linger as long. Smoke from central fires helped dry the interior, even if it irritated eyes and lungs. Here, stone traps dampness the way it traps cold. The two reinforce each other. The castle becomes a reservoir not just of power, but of winter itself. You take a slow breath and feel the air cool your throat. It's not sharp. It's persistent. This is the kind of cold that makes you tired rather than alarmed. It wears you down over days and weeks, not minutes. There's a quiet irony in the fact that moats, symbols of strength and safety, contributed so much to internal discomfort. Water defended the castle from enemies while quietly undermining those inside. Protection always came with a price. You imagine spring arriving outside, snow melting, ground softening. Inside, walls weep gently as stored moisture releases itself, even as temperatures rise. The castle remains cold and damp, lagging behind the season like a shadow that won't lift. As you move away from the outer wall, the air shifts slightly, becoming less heavy, still cold, but easier to breathe. You begin to understand how people navigated these spaces, choosing routes and rooms based on subtle changes in air and texture. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. Stone, height, drafts, smoke, and now moisture all work together. None of them alone make the castle unbearable. Together, they create an environment that constantly leans toward cold. And as you continue onward, the damp fades just enough to remind you how much worse it could be. In castles, winter wasn't just a season. It was something the building stored, protected, and slowly released, long after the world outside had moved on. You begin to feel it now as a kind of absence, not the presence of cold. Exactly, but the absence of warmth where it ought to be. You stand near a hearth that's been burning for hours. Yet the upper reaches of the room remain untouched. The heat has gone somewhere else, somewhere above you. Lost in height, you look up again, and the ceiling seems even farther away than before. The space above your head feels empty, cavernous, and oddly wasteful. Warm air gathers there, floating uselessly near beams and stone vaults no one can reach. Down where you live, breathe, and sleep, the air stays stubbornly cool. This wasn't a mystery to medieval people. Anyone who had ever warmed their hands by a fire knew that heat rises. What castles did was exaggerate that truth. Their ceilings weren't just high, they were dramatically high, designed to impress visitors and reinforce the power of the lord who ruled beneath them. Great halls were built to feel overwhelming. Tall walls, soaring roofs, long sightlines. They made gatherings feel grand and authority feel distant. The problem was that warmth followed the same vertical logic. The more impressive the space, the more ineffective the fire became. You imagine standing in one of these halls during winter, watching smoke and heat rise together, thinning as they go. By the time warmth reaches the ceiling, it has lost much of its strength. It lingers there, trapped, unable to fall back down. The people below never benefit. Some castles tried to address this by hanging large fabric canopies or banners from ceilings. These weren't just decorative. They helped break up air circulation, trapping some warmth lower in the room. The effect was modest, but noticeable. Even a slight barrier mattered in a space this tall. You notice that private chambers tend to feel different. Smaller, lower, more enclosed. These rooms were often added later or adapted over time as living needs became clearer. Here, fires actually make a difference. Heat collects closer to the floor. The air feels less hostile. Still, even these rooms suffer from the castle's overall scale. Warmth leaks upward through stairwells, vents, and open doorways. It escapes into larger spaces, pulled away by the building's vertical hunger. There's a quiet tension here between public and private life. Public spaces remain cold, symbolic, and uncomfortable. Private spaces attempt warmth, but only partially succeed. The architecture itself enforces hierarchy through temperature. Power stays cold. Intimacy seeks warmth. Some architectural historians suggest that this discomfort was accepted, even expected. Grandeur mattered more than comfort. A lord who complained about cold might appear weak. Endurance became part of leadership, a silent performance of toughness enacted daily. You think about winter gatherings again. Long feasts where people sat wrapped in cloaks. Breath visible, even indoors. Food cooled quickly on plates. Wine needed warming. Movement became essential just to stay comfortable. In contrast, peasant homes with low ceilings trapped heat efficiently. Fires warmed the entire space. Smoke lingered. Yes, but warmth stayed close to the body. The castle, for all its wealth, struggled to achieve the same basic comfort. You take a few slow steps and feel the temperature change almost imperceptibly. Lower near the floor, colder near walls, slightly warmer near the fire, but only within reach. The rest of the room remains untouched. There's an old comment from a visiting diplomat describing a castle hall as lofty and chill, more fit for banners than men. It's a perfect summary. The building serves ideas before it serves people. As you move on, the ceiling lowers slightly, and the air responds immediately. It feels marginally warmer, more contained. It's a reminder that architecture shapes experience in powerful, often unintended ways. By now, the cold no longer surprises you. It feels inevitable. Every design choice points upward, away from human comfort. Heat follows, obediently, leaving people behind. And as you continue deeper into the castle, the lesson settles in. Height may inspire awe, but it also steals warmth. In these towering spaces, winter doesn't need to work very hard. The building does most of the work for it. You start to notice something subtle as you move through the castle. Certain rooms feel untouched, almost paused in time. Furniture pushed against walls. Hearths cold and dark. Doorways rarely opened. It isn't neglect. It's strategy. Not every part of the castle is meant to be lived in all year. As winter settles in, life contracts. The castle doesn't shut down, but it does retreat. People abandon the most exposed spaces first. High towers, outer chambers, grand halls used for ceremony more than survival. These rooms become storage, passageways, or simply empty shells until warmer months return. This seasonal shift was so normal that it rarely drew comment. Castle life followed the rhythm of weather as much as it followed the calendar. When cold arrived, comfort wasn't improved. It was rationed. Warmth was concentrated into fewer rooms, fewer fires, fewer people. You imagine the household slowly shrinking inward, doors closed and barred not against enemies, but against wind, curtains pulled tight, fires lit only where bodies would gather. The rest of the castle fades into shadow, its stone holding cold without complaint. This wasn't laziness or failure. It was adaptation. Heating an entire castle was impossible. Heating a handful of rooms was merely difficult. Families learned which chambers held warmth best. Lower floors, interior rooms, spaces surrounded by other rooms rather than outer walls. Those became winter living quarters. There's an overlooked detail in medieval household planning that reflects this clearly. Some castles had distinct winter halls, smaller versions of the Great Hall used only during colder months. These rooms sacrificed grandeur for survivability. Lower ceilings, thicker curtains, fires that actually made a difference. You picture the contrast. In summer, the Great Hall fills with light, banners, voices. In winter, it stands empty, vast and echoing, while life unfolds quietly elsewhere. Power withdraws into smaller spaces, less visible but more human. Letters from the period sometimes mention relocating sleeping arrangements with the seasons. Beds moved, screens repositioned, entire households reshuffled to take advantage of slightly better conditions. Comfort was mobile. You followed it where you could find it. There's a faint sense of impermanence to all this. The castle looks solid and unchanging from the outside, but inside, its use is fluid. Rooms have moods, seasons, and purposes that shift with the weather. Winter redraws the map. Some scholars suggest that this seasonal abandonment shaped social behavior. Fewer shared spaces meant tighter groups. Hierarchies became more visible, as access to warm rooms was controlled carefully. Who slept where mattered even more when space was limited. You think about servants now. They followed warmth too, but not always by choice. Their sleeping places were often wherever heat was least valuable to those above them. Corridors, storage rooms, near kitchens where fires burned. But smoke and drafts competed fiercely. There's a quiet cruelty in that arrangement, but also practicality. Fires meant cooking and work. Those areas stayed active regardless of season. Sleeping nearby meant noise, smoke, and movement, but also a chance at warmth. You move through a passageway that feels colder than the rest, clearly unused. The air is still, heavy, untouched by bodies. It's easy to imagine this space sealed off for months, visited only when absolutely necessary. Cold thrives in emptiness. In contrast, rooms that remain in use feel different. The air carries traces of human presence, faint warmth, smells of food and smoke. Sound behaves differently when people occupy a space regularly. The castle becomes uneven. Patchwork, alive in some areas and dormant in others. There's no universal agreement on how much of a castle was typically abandoned in winter. It varied widely by region, wealth, and design. Some smaller castles stayed fully occupied. Larger complexes might shrink dramatically. What remains consistent is the principle. You don't fight winter everywhere. You choose where to fight it. You imagine winter evenings now, fewer candles lit, fewer doors open, conversations closer, quieter. The castle feels less like a fortress and more like a cluster of shelters clinging together inside stone. This seasonal retreat also changes how people experience power. Grand spaces meant to awe visitors are empty when cold dominates. Authority becomes quieter, more intimate. Decisions happen near fires, not beneath soaring ceilings. It's another reminder that castles were never static monuments. They were lived environments, constantly adjusted to survive. The cold didn't defeat them. but it reshaped daily life in ways stone alone could not resist. As you move toward the next occupied chamber, the temperature rises just slightly, not enough to call warm, but enough to feel intentional. This is where winter life happens. Everything else can wait. And as you settle into that smaller, more contained space, you understand something important. Castles didn't conquer winter. They negotiated with it. Season by season, room by room, choosing survival over spectacle until the cold loosened its grip. You notice the fabric before you notice the warmth. Heavy cloth hangs along the walls, thick enough to soften the harsh lines of stone. The colors are deep, muted by smoke and age, but still rich. As you pass close, the air feels different here. Not warm exactly, but less sharp, less biting. The stone behind the fabric has been pushed just a little farther away from your skin. Tapestries were never only decoration. In a castle, they were tools. They dulled echoes, softened light, and most importantly, slowed the movement of cold air. Stone walls radiated chill constantly. Covering them created a barrier, however thin, between human bodies and winter itself. You reach out and brush the edge of one. The fabric is thick, woven tight, often backed with additional layers. Behind it, air becomes trapped, forming a shallow pocket that resists temperature change. It's not much, but in a place like this, small advantages matter. Records from castle inventories list tapestries among the most valuable furnishings a household owned. They took years to produce, required skilled labor, and were expensive to transport. Their value wasn't just artistic. They made rooms livable. A hall without tapestries felt colder, louder, and harsher in every way. You imagine how these walls would look bare, stone exposed, cold radiating freely, sound bouncing unchecked. The difference is immediate. Fabric transforms the experience of space, even if it can't change the structure beneath. There's a detail many people miss. Tapestries were often seasonal, hung in winter, removed in summer, stored carefully to prevent damage. This wasn't about style changes. It was climate control. In warmer months, the same fabric that helped in winter trapped heat uncomfortably. You walk along the wall and notice how the tapestry ends just before a doorway. The air changes instantly. A thin line marks where fabric stops and stone begins. Cold slips through, reminding you that insulation here is selective, strategic, never complete. Some tapestries depicted scenes of hunting, battles, or lush landscapes. In winter, these images offered psychological warmth as well. Forests in summer, green fields, flowing water. The imagery mattered when the real world outside was locked in cold and grey. There's an odd detail mentioned in a few surviving letters about people pressing their backs against tapestries while sitting. It wasn't etiquette, it was instinct. Stone stole heat. Fabric slowed that theft. Even leaning made a difference. You notice how tapestries also reduce drafts. Air moving along walls loses speed when it meets fabric. The cold doesn't disappear, but it becomes less aggressive, less insistent. The room feels calmer, quieter, easier to inhabit. Still, tapestries were not everywhere. They marked important rooms, spaces meant for the lord. For guests, for display, servants' quarters rarely enjoyed such luxury. In those areas, stone remained exposed, and cold remained dominant. This creates another layer of hierarchy. Warmth becomes visible. You can see where comfort lives by where fabric hangs. Status isn't just worn, it's draped across the walls. There's no complete agreement on how effective tapestries truly were at retaining heat. Some argue their impact was mostly psychological. Others point to measurable differences in surface temperature behind covered walls. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. Comfort is as much about perception as physics. You pause in a room where tapestries hang on multiple walls. The air feels noticeably softer. Sound dampens. Even your breathing feels less sharp. It's still cold, but it's manageable. This is as close to indoor comfort as a castle can offer. You imagine winter nights here, candles flickering, fire burning low, tapestries absorbing smoke, scent, and stories. Over years, they become saturated with the life of the household. They carry warmth in more ways than one. Some families move their tapestries with them between residences, treating them as essential equipment rather than decoration. Wherever they went, these fabric walls followed, transforming unfamiliar stone into something almost familiar. You notice wear near the bottom edges, fabric rubbed thin where feet brushed past, where animals leaned, where people sat close to the ground. These marks are evidence of use, not neglect. This is where warmth mattered most. In contrast, peasant homes relied on smoke-darkened walls and close quarters to achieve a similar effect. Fabric wasn't necessary when bodies, animals, and fire filled the same small space. Castles needed artificial softness to counteract artificial scale. You step back and look at the room as a whole. Without the tapestries, it would feel hollow. With them, it feels contained, not warm, but held. That difference shapes how long you can stay without feeling drained. As you move on, leaving the fabric behind, the air sharpens again. Stone reasserts itself. The contrast makes the role of these woven walls unmistakable. They don't defeat the cold, they negotiate with it, buying time and comfort in a space designed without either in mind. And as you continue deeper into the castle, you carry that awareness with you. In a world built of stone and power, softness becomes technology, and warmth, however slight, hangs by a thread. By now, you begin to understand that the castle itself offers very little help. So people turn inward, not emotionally, but practically. Warmth, in this place, is something you wear. You picture layers first. Wool against skin. Another wool layer on top. Then heavier outer garments, lined with fur, if you're fortunate. Clothing here isn't fashion in the modern sense. It's portable shelter. Every fold traps air. Every seam slows heat loss. Getting dressed is an act of architecture. Even indoors, no one expects to be lightly clothed. Cloaks stay on. Hoods remain up. Sleeves are long and loose, designed to overlap and block drafts. Gloves are common, especially for older hands that stiffen quickly in the cold. Hats matter more than people realize. A covered head keeps precious warmth from escaping into all that empty space above. You notice how people would sit, wrapped, arms tucked close to bodies, hands hidden in sleeves, movement minimized to conserve heat. Stillness becomes efficient only when you're layered properly. There's a detail from period illustrations showing nobles wearing fur-lined robes indoors, even while seated near fires. This wasn't excess, it was necessity. Fire warmed surfaces, clothing warmed bodies. One could not replace the other. Sleep brings its own strategy. Beds are layered heavily. Straw mattresses, topped with wool blankets. Then fur covers on top. People often slept wearing day clothes, adding nightcaps and extra layers rather than changing into anything lighter. Undressing meant surrendering heat you might not get back. You imagine settling into bed now. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and animal oils. It's not unpleasant. It's reassuring. Each layer traps a bit more warmth, building a fragile pocket of comfort that lasts until morning. An easily missed detail in medieval wardrobes is how garments overlapped deliberately. Tunics extended well past the waist. Sleeves narrowed at the wrist. Gaps were minimized wherever possible. Even belts helped, tightening fabric to prevent cold air from circulating freely. Footwear mattered too. Soft leather shoes, sometimes lined, worn indoors to keep feet off cold floors. Removing shoes indoors, a modern habit of comfort, would have felt like punishment here. There's discussion among researchers about how much people truly acclimated to cold versus how much they compensated with clothing. The answer seems to be both. Bodies adapt to some extent, but without layers. Endurance has limits. Clothing extended those limits dramatically. You think again about servants. Their clothing was simpler, but still layered. Even coarse wool provides insulation when worn thickly. Wealth affected quality, not the basic strategy. Everyone wrapped themselves against the same cold. There's an odd note in one household account about repairing sleeves more often than hems. Arms moved more. Drafts found their way inside faster there. Clothing wore out where warmth mattered most. You move through another chamber and imagine how different this felt compared to peasant homes. There. Heat filled the room. Here. Heat clings to the body. Comfort becomes personal rather than communal. This shifts social behavior. People cluster physically not just for conversation, but for shared warmth. Shoulders touch. Cloaks overlap. The castle's cold quietly encourages closeness, even among those who might otherwise keep distance. You realize that medieval fashion trends often reflect this reality. Long silhouettes, heavy fabrics, layers that seem excessive by modern standards. They weren't exaggeration. They were adaptation. As you walk on, wrapped in imagined wool and fur, the cold feels less aggressive. It's still there. But now it presses against layers instead of skin. That difference is everything. You understand now that castles didn't provide warmth the way buildings do today. They demanded that people bring their own. Clothing became insulation. Beds became microclimates. Fire became supplemental rather than central. And as you move deeper into the castle, cocooned in layers, the lesson settles in quietly. In a world of stone and drafts, survival depended not on changing the building, but on turning the human body itself into a warm, moving shelter. You begin to notice how the cold shapes time itself. Days inside the castle move differently in winter, paced not by clocks, but by temperature. Activities cluster around warmth. Everything else waits. Morning starts slowly. The fire has burned low overnight, reduced to ash and embers. The air feels heavy and unmoved, colder than it was when you went to sleep. Getting out of bed is an act of resolve. You hesitate, knowing the moment you break that cocoon of blankets, the cold will rush in and take its place. People rise in stages. Someone feeds the fire first. Others stay wrapped until the room changes just enough to make movement bearable. Work begins only once. Warmth reaches hands and joints. Cold fingers drop tools. Stiff muscles resist effort. Productivity depends on heat more than daylight. You move through the castle and see how routines bend around this reality. Meals are timed to coincide with active fires. Workspaces migrate closer to hearths. Tasks requiring precision wait until midday. When fires have had time to do their limited work, even conversation shifts. People speak less in cold rooms. Conserving energy, voices quieter, movements smaller. Laughter exists, but it's rarer, reserved for spaces where bodies can relax without fighting the air around them. You imagine scribes writing with ink that thickens in the cold. Hands ache. Mistakes increase. Some records mention warming ink pots near the fire to keep them usable. The environment dictates even the smallest details. There's a telling note in one castle account about bread being sliced closer to the hearth in winter because it hardened faster in the cold. Food behaves differently here. Stews cool quickly. Fat congeals. Eating becomes something you do fast, before warmth escapes the bowl. You notice how people reposition themselves constantly throughout the day. Chairs dragged closer to fires. Screens adjusted. Doors opened and closed not for privacy, but to manage airflow. The castle becomes a living system, adjusted moment by moment. Children are kept near warmth whenever possible. Older people, too. The cold targets them first. Younger, stronger bodies handle exposure better. So tasks are divided accordingly. Winter reshapes labor without ceremony. You step into a quieter room where no fire burns. It feels abandoned, but it's not forgotten. It's waiting. In summer, it will come alive again. For now, it exists only as storage and passage, Cold freezes parts of life along with space. There's disagreement among historians about how mentally taxing this environment was. Some suggest medieval people were simply accustomed to it. Others point to frequent complaints of weariness and illness during winter months. Both can be true. Adaptation doesn't mean ease. You think about sleep again. Nights are long. Fires are allowed to die down for safety. Darkness and cold arrive together. People sleep longer. Not from comfort, but from necessity. Energy is conserved. Dreams stretch. You begin to understand that castle life in winter is less about activity and more about endurance. The building dictates rhythm. Warmth allows movement. Cold enforces rest. As you continue onward, the pattern becomes familiar. Everything bends to temperature. The castle doesn't care. It remains what it is. People adjust, day after day, letting cold quietly write the schedule of their lives. By now, a comparison begins to form almost on its own. You don't force it. It simply appears, quietly, as you think about the way warmth behaves here versus somewhere else. Somewhere smaller, somewhere humbler, somewhere without towers. You picture a peasant home. Low and squat against the land. The roof slopes downward, close enough to touch. The walls are made of wood, wattle and daub, or packed earth. Nothing monumental, nothing meant to impress. And yet, in winter, that simplicity works in its favor. Inside such a home, the ceiling presses down close to the fire. Warm air rises. Yes, but it doesn't have far to go. It gathers above heads, spreads outward, and slowly settles back down. Heat stays where people live. It circulates in a tight loop, never given the chance to escape into unreachable heights. You imagine stepping inside after a long walk through snow. The door closes behind you, blocking most of the wind. Smoke hangs thick, stinging your eyes. But the warmth is immediate. It wraps around you, uneven and imperfect, but undeniable. Your hands loosen, your shoulders drop. In these homes, fire sits at the center of life. Cooking, eating, working, and resting all happen within its reach. The heat is shared, communal. No one gets much, but everyone gets something. Animals matter here too. In many regions, livestock share space with people during winter. Cows, goats, sheep. Their body heat adds to the room's warmth, turning breath and movement into insulation. It's not pleasant by modern standards, but it's effective. Warmth comes from life itself. You think back to the castle's stone floors and vast halls. Heat there is isolated, fragmented, privileged. In peasant homes, it's unavoidable. You live inside it whether you want to or not. There's an important distinction here. Peasant homes were designed for living. Castles were designed for defense. One accidentally solves the problem of warmth. The other never tries. You picture the walls of a peasant home. They aren't perfect barriers, but they breathe differently than stone. Wood doesn't steal heat as aggressively. Earth walls absorb warmth during the day and release it slowly at night. The materials themselves participate in temperature regulation. In contrast, castle stone absorbs cold and holds it. The building resists change. It takes warmth reluctantly and gives it up immediately. In winter, that resistance works against the people inside. You imagine sleeping in a peasant home now. Smoke drifts low. The air is thick and unpleasant. Your eyes burn. Your lungs work harder, but you're warm. Warm enough to sleep deeply. Warm enough that you don't wake every hour to reposition blankets. That trade becomes clearer the longer you think about it. Peasants accepted smoke and crowding in exchange for warmth. Nobles accepted cold and discomfort in exchange for security and status. Neither choice was ideal. Both were rational within their worlds. There's still debate about how consciously people recognize this difference. Some argue that peasants envied castle life without understanding its realities. Others point to evidence that people who moved between both worlds noticed immediately how uncomfortable castles could be. Familiarity breeds honesty. You recall accounts of travellers invited to stay in castles during winter, only to remark on how cold the rooms felt despite their grandeur. The surprise itself tells you something. Stone and scale promised comfort they did not deliver. You imagine a peasant stepping into a castle for the first time. The space overwhelms. The walls impress. But the cold cuts through everything, or fades quickly when fingers go numb. In peasant homes, movement is minimal. Everything you need is close. In castles, distance is constant. Distance from the fire, distance from warmth, distance from the ground. That separation costs energy. You begin to see warmth as a kind of social equalizer. In small homes, everyone shares it. In castles, warmth becomes stratified. Who sits closest to the fire matters. Who gets tapestries matters. Who sleeps in interior rooms matters. This difference shapes relationships. In peasant homes, bodies cluster naturally. In castles, proximity must be negotiated through rank. Cold enforces hierarchy just as surely as walls do. You think again about winter nights. In a peasant home, people and animals sleep close. Breaths overlapping. Heat pooling in shared space. In a castle, individuals retreat into separate beds, separate chambers, each fighting cold alone with layers and fabric. Neither world is comfortable by modern standards, but one world traps heat by accident, the other lets it escape by design. As you move on, the contrast stays with you. The castle's cold now feels less like a flaw and more like a consequence of ambition. Stone, height, and separation create power, but they also create distance from warmth. And in that distance, you finally understand the quiet irony. The poorest homes, built with survival in mind and nothing else, often offered more warmth than the greatest symbols of medieval wealth and authority ever could. You linger on that contrast a little longer, because it keeps unfolding in new ways. In peasant homes, nothing is wasted. Space is tight. Ceilings are low enough that you can almost feel them pressing warmth back down toward you. The room works with the fire instead of against it. You imagine stepping into one of these homes again, ducking slightly as you cross the threshold. The ceiling hangs just overhead, darkened by years of smoke. It's not beautiful, but it's efficient. Heat rises from the hearth and has nowhere dramatic to go. It spreads outward, clings to rafters, and slowly sinks back down, looping endlessly through the small space. The fire itself sits low, close to the ground. Flames lick upward, but their warmth radiates sideways as well. People sit, work, eat, and sleep within its reach, even when the fire burns down to embers. The room retains heat far longer than a castle hall ever could. Walls here are thick in a different way, not solid stone blocks, but layered materials, wattle woven with sticks, packed with mud, straw, and clay. These walls don't conduct heat the way stone does. They absorb warmth slowly and release it gently, smoothing out temperature changes over time. You picture winter nights in such a home. Outside, wind moves freely across fields. Inside, the air is still, smoke hangs low, but it also acts as a kind of blanket, trapping heat beneath the ceiling. It's not healthy by modern standards, but it's undeniably warm. Animals contribute more than people often realize. When cows or goats share the space, their body heat becomes part of the room's climate. Each breath adds warmth. Each shift of weight releases more. The house becomes a living system, warmed by life itself. You think back to the castle, where animals are kept outside or in separate buildings. Their heat is excluded along with their smell and noise. Cleanliness and order win, but warmth is sacrificed. There's something quietly clever about the peasant home's proportions. Nothing is oversized. Nothing reaches upward unnecessarily. Every dimension serves survival. Even the roof, low and thick with thatch, insulates against cold and traps rising heat. In castles, height is a statement. In peasant homes, height is a liability. Lower ceilings mean less air to heat, less space for warmth to disappear into. The physics are simple. Even if no one puts them into equations, you imagine sitting on a bench in a peasant home, feet near the fire, back against an earthen wall. The warmth is uneven, smoky, and imperfect. But it surrounds you. You don't need to chase it. It stays. This is where the difference becomes most striking. In castles, warmth is a privilege you move toward. In peasant homes, it's the default condition of the room. Cold exists, but it waits outside the walls. You reflect on how this shapes daily life. In small homes, people work steadily through winter. Hands stay flexible. Tools are usable. In castles, work slows, pauses, adapts constantly to temperature. There's a quiet dignity in that simplicity. The peasant home doesn't look impressive, but it performs its most basic job well. It keeps people alive and warm enough to function. You realize now that this wasn't an accident. Generations refined these structures through experience. If a roof leaked heat, it was lowered. If a wall let in too much wind, it was thickened. Survival feedback was immediate and unforgiving. In contrast, castles were planned once and altered slowly. Their scale made experimentation expensive. Mistakes became permanent features. As you move forward, the memory of low ceilings and central fires stays with you. It sharpens your understanding of what warmth really requires. Not wealth, not power, just proportion, proximity, and patience. And as the castle's cold settles around you again, that lesson becomes unmistakable. Sometimes, the smallest spaces hold the greatest comfort, simply because they were built for living, not for ruling. The thought of animals returns naturally now, not as an aside, but as something central. You begin to understand that warmth in the medieval world often came from bodies rather than buildings. Living heat mattered more than architecture, especially when winter pressed in hard. In peasant homes, animals were not distant, assets kept in separate structures. They were close, sometimes uncomfortably so. Cows, goats, sheep, even chickens shared space with people during the coldest months. This wasn't sentimentality. It was thermal logic. A large animal gives off a surprising amount of heat. Steadily, day and night. You imagine the sound first. Slow breathing, occasional shifting of weight, hooves scraping lightly against packed earth. That rhythm becomes part of the night. Beneath the smell and noise, warmth spreads outward, filling the small space in ways no fire alone could manage. People noticed this effect long before anyone tried to explain it. Homes with animals stayed warmer. Frost formed more slowly on walls. Morning cold felt less brutal. The difference didn't need measurement. You could feel it when you stepped inside. In castles, that warmth is absent. Animals are wealth. Yes, but also chaos. They are noisy, dirty, unpredictable. Castles value control. Livestock are housed separately, in stables or outer yards. Far from living quarters, their heat stays outside, along with their breath and bodies. You begin to sense how much this decision mattered. Removing animals from shared space removes a constant source of warmth. Fires burn down, bodies sleep, but animals continue radiating heat without pause. In peasant homes, that steady warmth fills the gaps left by dying embers. There's an old observation in rural accounts noting that winter nights felt longer in homes without animals, not because time changed, but because cold returned faster. Sleep became lighter. People woke more often to shift blankets or move closer together. You imagine a family settling in for the night, animals already lying down nearby. The room smells of hay and wool. Breath clouds mingle. The air stays warm enough that sleep comes easier, deeper. It's not comfort as you'd define it today, but it works. In contrast, Castle nights feel emptier. Larger rooms, separate chambers, silence broken only by wind and distant sounds, fires reduced for safety. Cold creeps in unchecked, with no living heat to push back. There's still some debate about how widespread indoor animal housing truly was. Practices varied by region, climate, and culture. Some homes kept animals in attached byres. Others shared a single room. What remains consistent is the logic behind it. Where winter was harsh, proximity increased. You think again about castle servants. They might sleep near kitchens or bakehouses, places where fires burned longer and animals sometimes passed through. Warmth followed work, not status. Those closest to labour sometimes slept warmer than those in grand chambers. You begin to see warmth as something medieval people actively managed through relationships. Between people and animals, between bodies, sharing space. Architecture provided a frame, but life filled it with heat. There's a small but telling detail in some winter illustrations showing people resting with dogs curled at their feet. Pets weren't just companions. They were blankets that breathed. Even small animals made a difference when every degree mattered. In castles, dogs existed too, but often slept in kennels or separate areas. Again, order prevailed over comfort. Clean floors mattered. Quiet mattered. Warmth did not outweigh these concerns. You imagine how different the castle would feel if animals shared space freely. Warmer. Yes. Also louder. Messier. Harder to control. Castles were built to project authority. Animals undermine that image simply by existing. This reveals something important. Warmth often comes from surrendering control, sharing space, accepting mess and noise. Peasant homes did this because survival demanded it. Castles avoided it because power demanded distance. You think about the physical effect again. Bodies clustered together create a microclimate. Heat accumulates. Air movement slows. Even drafts lose strength when space is crowded. In large castle rooms, air moves freely. In small shared spaces, it settles. That's why winter gatherings in peasant homes feel dense and close. Everyone benefits from everyone else. In castles, proximity is regulated. Distance is enforced. Cold thrives in that distance. You imagine lying down at night, animals breathing nearby. Their warmth steady and reliable. You don't need to chase it. You simply exist within it. Sleep deepens. Muscles relax. Then you imagine the castle again. Your bed surrounded by empty space. Stone walls pulling heat away. Silence amplifying every creak and gust. You rely entirely on fabric and fire, both limited and temporary. Neither life is easy, but one recycles warmth through living bodies. The other isolates bodies from each other in the name of order. As you move forward, the absence of animals in the castle feels louder than their presence ever would. The cold here isn't just physical. It's social. It reflects separation as much as stone. And as the night stretches on, that understanding settles gently. Warmth in the medieval world was often a shared resource, created by closeness, where closeness was discouraged. Winter always found more room to breathe. You begin to realize that warmth always comes with a cost. In peasant homes, that cost was smoke, thick, stinging, ever-present smoke that clung to hair and skin and turned ceilings black over time. But it also stayed low, heavy, and strangely helpful, pressing warmth downward instead of letting it escape. You imagine stepping into one of those homes again. The air hits your eyes immediately. They water. Your throat tightens. Breathing feels different, deliberate, yet your body relaxes at the same time. The heat is undeniable. It wraps around you, uneven but persistent, settling into your clothes and muscles. Smoke behaves differently in small spaces. With no tall chimneys to carry it away, it spreads, slows, and lingers. It's uncomfortable. Yes, but it also creates a barrier. Heat rises, meets the smoke layer, and is pushed back down. The ceiling becomes a low, invisible lid that keeps warmth where people live. This is not accidental. Over generations, people noticed that homes with more smoke stayed warmer. Complaints about stinging eyes existed alongside quiet acceptance that smoke was the price of surviving winter nights. Comfort was measured in temperature first, cleanliness second. You think again of castles, where smoke is treated as a problem to be removed. Large chimneys pull it upward efficiently, taking heat with it. Ventilation clears the air, but strips the room of warmth. Clean breathing comes at the expense of cold limbs. In peasant homes, the choice is reversed. You sacrifice air quality to preserve heat. Smoke becomes part of the architecture, as functional as walls and roofs. It stains everything, but it also saves lives. There's a detail buried in rural accounts noting that smoke-darkened beams lasted longer. The chemicals in smoke discouraged insects and slowed rot. Warmth, preservation, and survival quietly overlapped. What seemed unpleasant also served hidden purposes. You imagine winter evenings spent near the fire, eyes half closed, vision blurred by smoke. The discomfort fades into background noise as warmth takes priority. People adapt quickly when survival is at stake. In castles, adaptation takes a different form. You avoid smoke, but you endure cold. You breathe clean air while your joints stiffen and fingers numb. Each environment chooses its burden. There's still discussion among historians about how harmful constant smoke exposure truly was compared to chronic cold stress. Both took a toll. Both shaped health and longevity. The medieval world did not offer painless choices. You notice how this trade affects behavior. In smoky homes, people sit low, closer to the fire, where air is clearer and warmth strongest. In castles, people stand, move, rotate near fires to manage cold rather than smoke. At night, smoke settles differently. In peasant homes, it forms a hazy layer above sleeping bodies, trapping heat below. In castles, night air clears, but temperatures plunge as fires die down and ventilation continues its quiet work. You imagine lying awake in each place. In one, your eyes sting but your body relaxes. In the other, your breathing is easy, but sleep is shallow, interrupted by cold creeping in through layers. Neither option feels ideal, but one prioritizes warmth. The other prioritizes order and cleanliness. That difference reveals values as much as technology. You realize now that medieval people understood this balance intuitively. They didn't frame it as a choice between smoke and cold. They framed it as doing what worked. Peasant homes worked because they kept people warm enough to survive. Castles worked because they kept people safe from attack. Comfort was secondary, managed at the human level rather than the architectural one. As you move forward, the idea settles gently. Warmth is never free. It's borrowed from fire, from bodies, from compromise. Where smoke was tolerated, warmth stayed. Where smoke was banished, cold followed. And as winter deepened, people chose again and again which discomfort they could live with. Burning eyes or frozen fingers, thick air or aching joints. The decision shaped not just buildings, but daily life itself. You walk on, carrying that understanding with you. In the medieval world, survival often meant choosing the lesser discomfort, knowing that perfect comfort was never an option to begin with. As you keep walking, a quieter realization begins to settle in. Warmth in the medieval world wasn't fixed. It moved. It followed people rather than places. And once you notice that, the difference between castles and simpler homes becomes even sharper. In a peasant household, nothing is permanent. Benches shift. Beds are dragged closer to the fire. Tools migrate to wherever hands can stay warm enough to use them. The home adapts constantly, reshaping itself around heat. You don't heat the building. You move within it, chasing comfort in small, practical ways. You imagine a winter morning again. The fire burns low, so breakfast happens right beside it. Later, as embers strengthen, work spreads outward slightly. In the evening, everyone collapses back toward the center. The entire day traces a slow circle around warmth. That mobility matters. Furniture is light. Spaces are flexible. Nothing insists on staying where it is. Even people sleep where it makes sense, not where tradition demands. Survival encourages rearrangement. Now you think about castles. Everything here resists movement. Stone benches are built into walls. Heavy tables are fixed in place. Beds are large, solid, difficult to move. Rooms have defined purposes that don't change easily. Architecture asserts control, and control limits flexibility. If a room is cold, you don't redesign it. You endure it, or you abandon it entirely for the season. There's no gentle adjustment, no daily reshaping. The building dictates behavior, not the other way around. You notice how this affects daily rhythms. In peasant homes, warmth pulls people together dynamically. In castles, warmth exists in static pockets. You either have access to them or you don't. This becomes especially clear in winter evenings. In small homes, everyone gathers instinctively, drawn inward like moths to flame. In castles, gatherings are planned, formal, constrained by rank. You don't simply drift toward the fire. You are placed. You imagine a servant standing near a wall, watching heat pool around those of higher status. They feel it. Just out of reach. Mobility could fix that. But architecture and hierarchy forbid it. Warmth becomes another form of control. There's a telling contrast here. Peasant homes sacrifice permanence for adaptability. Castles sacrifice adaptability for permanence. One bends easily, the other stands firm. Even when standing firm makes life harder. You think again about winter nights. In a small home, bedding can be moved. People sleep closer together. Children are tucked between adults. Animals press near. The night rearranges itself around warmth. In castles, sleeping arrangements follow rules. Bedrooms are assigned. Beds stay put. Privacy matters more than proximity. Cold becomes something you manage alone. Some historians suggest this rigidity reinforced social order. Comfort flowed downward only so far. Endurance became part of elite identity. To rule meant tolerating discomfort with composure. You imagine a noble sitting stiffly near a fire, refusing to move closer lest it appear unseemly. Meanwhile, servants cluster where warmth is available, less constrained by appearances. Mobility belongs to those with less to lose. There's an odd inversion here. Those with fewer possessions can adapt more easily. Those surrounded by stone and wealth are trapped by it. You begin to see castles as monuments not just to power, but to immobility. Once built, they resist change. Their cold is baked in, unavoidable, monumental. Peasant homes, by contrast, feel temporary even when they last generations. Their flexibility allows them to respond to weather, bodies, and need. Warmth follows motion. Motion follows warmth. As you continue onward, the castle's corridors feel longer, more rigid. The cold here isn't just temperature. It's the absence of options. And that realization settles gently but firmly. In the medieval world, survival favored those who could move, adjust, and improvise. Where buildings refused to adapt, people were forced to endure. Warmth, you now understand, belongs to the flexible. You begin to feel how deeply warmth and status are tangled together here, not in obvious ways, not written on banners or carved into stone, but felt quietly, in where you're allowed to stand and how long you're allowed to stay there. Temperature becomes a language everyone understands without ever naming it. In the castle, warmth gathers where authority gathers. Near the hearth, in the inner chambers, in rooms wrapped with fabric and shielded from wind. Access to those spaces isn't random. It follows rank with almost mathematical precision. The closer you are to power, The closer you are to heat, you imagine a winter gathering again, the lord seated nearest the fire, not just because it's comfortable, but because it reinforces position. Important guests are placed within that warm radius. Everyone else forms a widening ring, each step outward marking a drop in temperature and influence. You don't need words to understand where you belong. Your fingers tell you, this isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's habit. Order. In a rigid society, even warmth must be organized. Random comfort threatens structure. If everyone could drift freely toward heat, hierarchy would blur. So movement is controlled, seating assigned, proximity managed. You feel the contrast sharply when you think back to peasant homes. There. Warmth has no owner. It spreads where bodies gather. Children climb into laps. Neighbors sit shoulder to shoulder. Heat doesn't ask who you are. It only responds to closeness. In castles, closeness itself is regulated. Who may sit beside whom matters. Who may share space matters. Warmth becomes a reward rather than a shared resource. There's a revealing detail in descriptions of medieval feasts mentioning guests wearing cloaks throughout the meal. This wasn't casual. It was necessary. Even among the privileged, warmth was never guaranteed. Rank determined how much discomfort you were expected to tolerate without complaint. Endurance became a virtue. To rule well meant showing that cold did not trouble you. Stiff posture, controlled movement, calm expression. Warmth was present, but never indulged in openly. Seeking it too eagerly could look weak. You imagine a noble resisting the urge to lean closer to the fire. Even as fingers numb, appearances matter. The performance of control matters. The cold becomes part of the performance. Below them, servants work continuously near heat sources. Kitchens burn hot all day. Bakehouses glow with warmth. Ironically, those spaces are often warmer than grand halls. Labor earns proximity to fire. Even if it comes with smoke and exhaustion, you notice the inversion. Those with power endure cold publicly. Those without power endure heat privately. While working, neither group lives comfortably. Comfort itself is not the goal. There's still debate among historians about whether this was intentional social signaling or simply a byproduct of architecture and habit. Some suggest cold reinforced authority by demanding stoicism. Others argue people simply accepted discomfort because alternatives were limited. Both ideas likely coexist. You think again about winter councils and legal proceedings held in cold halls. Long hours standing or sitting in chill air. Decisions made with stiff hands and aching joints. Authority exercised under physical strain. It's easy to imagine how that environment shaped temperament. Patience shortened. Tempers sharpened. Warmth affects mood more than people realize. Cold rooms encourage formality. Distance. Restraint. In peasant homes, warmth encourages closeness. Conversation flows easily when bodies are relaxed. In castles, cold maintains distance. It enforces silence and structure without needing words. You move through another chamber now, and feel the temperature shift subtly as you cross an invisible boundary. A doorway marks the edge of privilege. On one side, fabric lines the walls. On the other, bare stone waits. The difference is immediate. You realize how this would feel day after day. The body learns these boundaries instinctively. You know where you're welcome by where your hands stay warm. Children raised in castles grow up with this logic embedded in them. They learn where to stand, when to move, how long to endure. Warmth becomes something you earn or inherit, not something you assume. In peasant homes, children learn the opposite. Warmth comes from togetherness. You make room. You share space. Heat is communal by necessity. Neither system is kind. Both are survival strategies shaped by circumstance. But one system ties warmth to power so tightly that even stone walls seem to enforce it. As you continue onward, the castle feels colder, not because the temperature drops, but because the meaning of cold sharpens. It's no longer just winter. It's order, distance, Structure made physical. And as that understanding settles, you begin to see the castle differently, not as a failed home, but as a successful symbol. It does exactly what it was built to do, even if that means sacrificing comfort. Warmth, here, is never accidental. It follows status. It marks boundaries. It reminds everyone, quietly and constantly, of where they stand. You walk on, hands tucked into sleeves, aware now that the cold isn't merely environmental, it's social. And in this place, that makes it even harder to escape. You slow your pace now, not because the space demands it, but because the idea settling in your mind needs room. There's a question hovering here, one that never quite resolves itself. Even after centuries of looking back, was all this cold simply tolerated? Or was it, in some quiet way, useful? You think about discomfort as a tool, not spoken of openly, not written into law, but present all the same. Cold sharpens behavior. It discourages lingering. It limits softness. In a society built on hierarchy and obedience, those effects might not have been entirely unwelcome. Some interpretations suggest that living in cold, austere spaces reinforced discipline. You didn't relax too much. You didn't forget your place. The environment itself reminded you that comfort was not a right, but a privilege, rationed carefully. Stone walls and cold air worked together to keep bodies alert and minds focused. But there's another way to read it, one where cold isn't intentional at all, just accepted. Medieval builders understood many things, but they worked within limits of technology, tradition, and urgency. Castles were built quickly in response to threats. Defense came first. Everything else followed, if it could. You imagine a lord commissioning a castle. Their concerns are clear. Height, thickness, visibility, strength. The question of warmth barely enters the conversation. Fires exist. Clothing exists. People have endured winter before. The cold feels survivable, even if unpleasant. Yet the fact that so many efforts were made to soften it complicates that picture. Tapestries, curtains, winter chambers, portable warming pans. These are not the actions of people indifferent to comfort. They're the actions of people constantly negotiating with discomfort. So where does that leave the question? Was the cold a feature or a flaw? You walk through a space that feels deliberately bare. No fabric. No furniture meant for lingering. Just stone and shadow. This kind of room feels instructional. It doesn't invite you to stay. It encourages you to move along, to finish your business and leave. In contrast, rooms meant for rest or intimacy feel carefully managed. Lower ceilings, softer surfaces, less exposure. Someone thought about how cold shaped behavior, even if they didn't phrase it that way. Some scholars lean toward the idea that discomfort helped reinforce authority. Cold made formal gatherings shorter. It discouraged casual behavior. It reminded everyone that the castle was not a place of ease, but of order. Others argue that this interpretation overstates intent. They point out that medieval people complained endlessly about cold in letters and records. If discomfort were truly desirable, why complain at all? Why invest so much effort in mitigating it? The evidence points both ways. Complaints exist alongside adaptations. Endurance is praised, but relief is constantly sought. The cold is neither fully embraced nor fully rejected. You imagine winter councils held in drafty halls. People stand straighter, speak less, make decisions efficiently. Was that because of discipline? Or because no one wanted to linger, perhaps both? You think again about the contrast with peasant homes. There, warmth encourages conversation, storytelling, long evenings by the fire, time stretches. In castles, cold compresses time. It sharpens moments. It limits indulgence. This difference shapes culture subtly. Formality thrives in cold spaces. Informality thrives in warm ones. Castles cultivate distance. Homes cultivate closeness. You pause near a window, feeling the cold air brush your face again. It's easy to imagine someone centuries ago standing here, feeling the same thing, asking the same unspoken question. Is this how it has to be? There's no single answer. Medieval life didn't operate on clean intentions. It operated on necessity, habit, and inherited design. Cold persisted because it was manageable, not because it was ideal. What's clear is that the cold became normalized. Children grew up in it. Adults measured themselves against it. Enduring winter without complaint became part of identity, especially among elites. You consider how that mindset would shape leadership. Rulers accustomed to discomfort might expect others to endure hardship as well. Cold rooms teach patience, but they also teach indifference to suffering. At the same time, shared endurance can build solidarity among those at the top. Surviving winter together, even uncomfortably, becomes part of collective identity. The castle's cold binds its inhabitants through shared strain. As you move on, the question remains open, unresolved. Just like history itself, was the cold intentional, accidental, useful, harmful? The answer shifts depending on where you stand, both socially and physically. And perhaps that ambiguity is the point. The castle doesn't explain itself. It simply exists, imposing its conditions on everyone inside. People respond as best they can, adapting, complaining, enduring, softening edges where possible. You continue walking, aware now that the cold around you carries layers of meaning. It's physical, yes, but it's also cultural, social, psychological. And as the corridors stretch ahead, you realize that understanding medieval cold means accepting uncertainty. Some things were chosen, some things were endured. Most were simply lived with, day after winter day, until they felt inevitable. By this point, the image you might have carried into this story has thinned and cracked, much like frost on old stone. The idea of medieval luxury, of grand halls warmed by roaring fires and effortless comfort, doesn't survive long once you linger inside these walls. The myth dissolves quietly, replaced by something far more ordinary and far colder. You think about how castles are usually imagined today. Golden torchlight, long tables heavy with food, thick carpets underfoot. It's an image shaped by paintings, films, and later romantic storytelling. But those images freeze a moment and strip away the hours before and after. When the fire dwindles, the smoke clears, and the cold returns to claim the room. In reality, luxury in a castle was visual and symbolic far more than physical. Tapestries impressed guests. Stonework projected permanence. Height inspired awe. None of that guaranteed warmth. In fact, much of it actively worked against it. You imagine a visitor arriving for the first time, dazzled by the scale. The entrance alone feels overwhelming. The walls seem endless. The ceilings disappear into shadow. At first, the cold barely registers, dulled by excitement and movement. But as the hours pass, as the body stills, the truth settles in. Grandeur doesn't insulate. There's an old travel account describing a winter stay in a northern castle, where the writer marvels at the richness of the furnishings while complaining. Almost in the same breath, that ink froze overnight in his chamber. The contrast is striking. Wealth surrounds him, yet basic comfort remains elusive. You begin to see how this disconnect shaped expectations. Nobility did not define luxury by warmth. Warmth was common. Anyone could have it in a small, crowded home. Luxury was separation, space, privacy, security. Those things came at a thermal cost. Even bedding reflects this. Castle beds were large, impressive structures, often raised high off the floor and surrounded by curtains. They looked inviting, but their size meant more air to warm, more fabric to trap cold before heat could build. Peasant bedding, simpler and closer to the ground, warmed faster through shared body heat. You picture a noble settling into bed, Curtains drawn tight, blankets layered thick. It takes time for warmth to accumulate. Until then, the cold presses in from all sides. Sleep arrives slowly, negotiated rather than granted. This reframes the idea of medieval excess. Food could be abundant. Yes, clothing could be fine, but environmental comfort remained stubbornly out of reach. Even for the powerful, the castle gave safety and status. It did not give ease. You think again about how often nobles travelled between residences. This wasn't just political, it was practical. Different castles behaved differently in winter. Some were drier, some less exposed. Moving offered variety, and occasionally, relief. Meanwhile, peasants stayed put, anchored to land and home. Their houses, though poor in material terms, offered consistency. The fire behaved the same way each night. The ceiling stayed low. The walls responded predictably. Warmth was imperfect but reliable. There's a quiet irony here. The very things we associate with comfort today, space and privacy, were liabilities in winter. Small, crowded spaces retained heat better. Togetherness insulated more effectively than solitude. You begin to realize how misleading the word luxury can be when applied across centuries. What feels luxurious now would have felt inefficient then. What felt tolerable then would feel unbearable now. This is why modern visitors are often surprised when touring castle ruins. Even in summer, the chill surprises them. Guides mention it casually, almost apologetically. The building hasn't changed. Expectations have. You walk through another chamber and imagine it furnished fully. Rugs on the floor, tapestries on the walls, candles burning. It still wouldn't feel warm by modern standards. The cold would soften, but never disappear. Comfort would remain conditional. You think about how medieval people talked about comfort at all. The word existed, but it didn't carry the same meaning. Comfort meant reassurance, emotional support, relief from fear. Physical warmth was part of that, but not its center. Security mattered more. Being safe behind stone walls, even if cold, was preferable to being warm and vulnerable. That trade-off shaped priorities deeply. You pause and let that settle. The castle wasn't failing at comfort. It was succeeding at something else entirely. Its cold was a side effect, not a mistake. One people accepted because the alternative felt worse. As you move on, the myth continues to fall away. Castles were not warm palaces. They were fortified shelters where warmth had to be chased, rationed, and improvised. Their luxury lay in survival, not softness. And in that realization, something becomes clearer. The medieval world didn't misunderstand comfort. It simply defined it differently, measuring it not by temperature, but by safety, continuity, and endurance through the long, quiet winters. You start to see a pattern that runs deeper than stone or fire. When the cold could not be changed, people changed themselves. Not dramatically, not heroically, quietly, through habit. The castle stayed the same, but the way life moved inside it slowly bent around winter's limits. Daily routines shifted without announcement. People rose later, conserving warmth beneath blankets until the fire had strength again. Tasks that required fine movement waited for the warmest hours of the day. Heavy labor happened earlier, while bodies were still generating heat from motion. You imagine someone pausing at the threshold of a cold room, weighing whether the task inside is worth the chill. Often, it isn't, so it waits. The castle teaches patience by force, slowing everything down until movement feels deliberate rather than automatic. Meals change too. Food becomes thicker, heavier. Stews and porridges dominate because they hold warmth longer. Eating quickly is replaced by lingering near the fire, not for pleasure, but practicality. Warm bowls become hand warmers as much as nourishment. Sleeping patterns shift in response. People stay in bed longer, not because they're rested, but because leaving it costs too much heat. Darkness and cold stretch the night. Sleep fills the space where activity would normally be. You notice how clothing becomes more than attire. It dictates behavior. Stiff layers limit movement, encouraging slower gestures and careful steps. Even posture changes. Shoulders hunch, arms fold inward, bodies curl slightly, instinctively guarding warmth. There's a small but telling detail in winter household notes mentioning reduced cleaning schedules. Water was cold, floors were colder. Tasks that required exposure were postponed unless absolutely necessary. Cleanliness gave way to endurance. Children adapt fastest. They learn where warmth lives. They cluster instinctively. They curl into corners and laps without instruction. The castle shapes them from the beginning, teaching where comfort hides and where it does not. Older bodies struggle more. Joints ache. Movement stiffens. Winter slows them down further, limiting where they can go and what they can do. Warmth becomes not just comfort, but access to life itself. You think again about peasant homes. There, the building adapts to life. In castles, life adapts to the building. That difference matters deeply. It determines who thrives and who merely endures. Some historians suggest that this constant adjustment shaped medieval resilience. People grew used to operating under constraint. Cold sharpened awareness. It demanded planning, cooperation, and foresight. Others argue it came at a cost. Chronic discomfort drains energy. It narrows horizons. When survival consumes attention, creativity and ease fade. Cold makes life functional rather than expansive. Both views feel true as you walk on. The castle's cold produces discipline, but it also produces fatigue. It enforces order, but it limits possibility. You pause in a smaller room where signs of adaptation are everywhere. Hooks for extra cloaks, screens positioned to block drafts, a chair placed precisely where warmth lingers longest. Nothing here is accidental. This room has been learned over time. You imagine someone entering it blindfolded, finding warmth by memory alone. Bodies remember where cold lives. They avoid it instinctively. The castle becomes a map of sensations as much as space. Over generations, these adaptations solidify into tradition. Winter routines passed down without explanation. This is how we do things when the cold comes. No one questions it anymore. As you move forward, the lesson settles gently. The castle didn't defeat winter. It trained people to live alongside it, reshaping habits, rhythms, and expectations until cold became background rather than crisis. And in that quiet adaptation, medieval life continued, not comfortably, not easily, but persistently, adjusted just enough to endure. By now, the irony feels impossible to ignore. The very thing meant to symbolize strength, wealth, and permanence becomes a source of quiet suffering. Stone, so expensive to quarry and haul, so difficult to shape and raise, turns against the people it was meant to serve. It protects them. Yes, but it also drains them, slowly and without drama. You walk through another chamber and let your hand trail along the wall. The stone is cold in a way that feels deliberate, almost judgmental. It doesn't respond to you. It doesn't soften with time or presence. It remains exactly as it was built to be, indifferent to the bodies that brush past it day after day. Wealth made this possible. Only those with resources could afford walls this thick, ceilings this high, floors this solid. Poverty forced simplicity, and simplicity, unintentionally, solved problems wealth created. You imagine a peasant watching a castle rise stone by stone. From the outside, it looks like safety itself, a refuge, a symbol of stability. But from the inside, it becomes clear that stability comes at a cost paid in warmth and ease. The irony deepens when you consider maintenance. Stone buildings require constant care. Mortar cracks, walls shift, damp creeps in. The castle demands attention even as it punishes those who live inside it. Meanwhile, smaller homes are repaired quickly, patched with earth and straw, adjusted season by season without ceremony. You think again about winter nights. In a peasant home, the fire dies down, but warmth lingers in the packed space. In the castle, the fire dies down and cold reasserts itself immediately, reclaiming stone inch by inch. Wealth creates a larger surface for winter to occupy. There's a quiet absurdity in imagining a lord wrapped in fur, sleeping beneath a carved canopy bed, while a farmer nearby sleeps warmer on a straw pallet beside livestock. Status reverses expectations. Comfort flows downward, not upward. Some commentators note that medieval literature occasionally hints at this contradiction. Castles are described as magnificent but bleak, impressive but harsh. The language reflects admiration tempered by discomfort, as if writers sense the imbalance without fully articulating it. You pause in a hallway where the cold feels especially strong, amplified by stone on all sides. This is what wealth looks like when stripped of illusion. Durable, lasting, unyielding. Stone does not negotiate. It simply endures. And yet, people endure with it. They hang fabric. They wear layers. They cluster near fires. They move through seasons with practiced resilience. The castle doesn't change, but life inside it adjusts endlessly. You realize now that wealth in the medieval world bought time more than comfort. Time to withstand siege. Time to survive political shifts. Time to endure winter behind walls that would not fall. Warmth was secondary to longevity. This perspective reshapes how you understand medieval priorities. People weren't blind to discomfort. They simply valued other things more. Safety outweighed ease. Continuity outweighed pleasure. The cold was tolerated because the alternative felt worse. You walk on, feeling the weight of stone above and around you. It presses not physically, but conceptually, this building was never meant to cradle. It was meant to last. And as that realization settles, the irony becomes almost gentle. Stone wealth freezes. Human adaptability flows around it. One is rigid, the other survives by bending. In that contrast, the medieval world reveals itself not as cruel or foolish, but as pragmatic within its limits. Comfort was negotiable. Survival was not. You continue forward. The cold, now familiar, no longer shocking. It has become part of the story the castle tells, one carved as deeply into stone as any coat of arms or battlement. And in that story, wealth stands tall and cold, while life finds its warmth elsewhere. In movement, in closeness, and in the quiet art of enduring. You slow almost without realizing it, as if the castle itself has asked you to. By now, the cold no longer surprises you. It has become familiar, even instructive. It tells a story, not just about weather or architecture, but about how people were divided, sorted, and shaped by the spaces they inhabited. Temperature, you realize, was never neutral. It marked boundaries just as clearly as walls or doors. Warmth gathered in certain rooms, around certain people. At certain times, cold filled the rest, and everyone learned, from childhood onward, how to read those invisible lines. You imagine a child growing up inside these walls. Long before they understand rank or law, they understand where it feels better to stand, where the air softens, where fingers stop aching. Warmth teaches hierarchy without words. It trains bodies before it trains minds. In peasant homes, that lesson runs in the opposite direction. Warmth teaches closeness. It teaches sharing. You make room. You adjust. You learn that survival depends on togetherness, not separation. The environment rewards cooperation directly and immediately. Here, in the castle, warmth rewards position. It reinforces distance. It reminds everyone that comfort flows downward only so far. Even when people gather, the space between them matters. Cold fills gaps eagerly, making separation tangible. You think back over everything you felt while moving through these rooms. The stone that steals heat, the drafts that never rest, the fires that struggle against scale, the fabric that softens but never conquers, the routines that shrink inward as winter deepens. All of it adds up to more than discomfort. It adds up to structure. The castle doesn't just house hierarchy. It enacts it physically. It makes inequality felt in muscles and skin. Some people endure less cold, others endure more, and endurance itself becomes a marker of identity. There's a strange honesty in that. Nothing is hidden. You feel your place every moment. You don't need reminders carved into law. Your body knows. At the same time, you see how this system depends entirely on human adaptation. The building never meets people halfway. It doesn't soften. It doesn't adjust. All the flexibility lives in habits, clothing, movement, and social arrangement. That's why the comparison with peasant homes matters so much. Those spaces bend easily. They respond to life. Castles resist. And in that resistance, they shape behavior. You pause near an inner doorway, feeling the air change subtly as you cross it. Warmer here. Still cold, but less punishing. This is the heart of winter life in the castle. Everything else fades into the background until spring. You understand now that medieval cold wasn't just endured. It was organized, managed, distributed. It reinforced values quietly, day after day, without speeches or commands. And as you stand there, wrapped in layers, listening to the distant sound of wind against stone, the final contrast settles in fully. Peasant homes were warmer because they were built for living. Castles were colder because they were built for lasting. Neither choice was wrong within its world. Each answered a different fear. One feared hunger and exposure. The other feared invasion and collapse. Warmth and security pulled in opposite directions, and medieval society chose where to compromise. You take one last slow breath and feel the cold around you. Steady and patient. It has been here longer than you. It will remain long after. But people, for centuries, found ways to live inside it anyway. And in that quiet endurance, the medieval world reveals itself most clearly, not as a place of constant misery or romantic comfort, but as a place where survival meant adapting to conditions you could not change, and finding warmth where you could, even if it wasn't where you expected. The castle remains cold. The people move on. Now let your pace slow completely. You no longer need to walk these corridors. You can rest where you are, wrapped in the quiet understanding of how this place worked, how people learned to exist inside stone and winter without ever truly defeating either. The cold softens as you stop resisting it. It becomes background, like the distant wind outside the walls. You imagine fires settling into embers, the castle growing still, its great spaces empty and patient. Somewhere deeper inside, smaller rooms glow faintly, holding the last traces of warmth and life. You picture people curling into blankets, drawing fabric closer, breathing slowly. The day has been long, the winter longer, but everything that needs to be done has been done. The castle stands. The night passes. Your own breathing steadies now, slow, even. The story doesn't need to push forward anymore. It can fade gently, like heat rising and thinning into the dark above. You carry with you the quiet lesson of these walls. That comfort is not always where power lives. That warmth often survives in smaller places, closer together, nearer the ground, and that humans have always been remarkably good at adjusting, at finding calm even in spaces that were never meant to be kind. Let the stone cool, let the fire dim, let the sounds soften until only silence remains. The castle sleeps, and now, so can you. Sweet dreams.